Hello, hello. Howdy, I'm Jason Marsh. I'm the CEO of Flow Immersive, but that doesn't matter because I get to introduce our next speaker here. His name is Daniel Robinson. He's the founder and CEO of Red 6. So Red 6 is a revolutionary technology firm at the forefront of synthetic air combat training. Got to see it to believe it. He hails from England, and he served as a Royal Air Force instructor on the U.S. Air Force on the and he's a Tornado F3 pilot, and he also has an MBA from Georgetown University. So I'm going to let him tell you about the product, but pretty great background to start with. Daniel?
Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending this talk. Hopefully it's going to be interesting for you. I'm going to start with a big, bold statement. Augmented reality is a solution in search of a problem. And if you ponder that for a second, augmented reality is a solution in search of a problem. Now, I know that's a big, bold statement to make at an AR conference or AWE, and before you all drag me off stage kicking and screaming, allow me to give context, because fundamentally, I'm a huge believer in the tech. I think augmented reality represents the single biggest inflection point in how we will ultimately share and interact with information since computers went to cell phones. But that's a little ways off, and until we get to that ubiquitous AR solution, where the data is around us, outdoor in a mobile environment, and it's seamless to interact with the real world, we have a long way to go. And I think as an industry, as an AR industry, we're getting it wrong. And I think there's been too much focus on cool tech and tech demos and not enough focus on use case. What are we fundamentally going to use this technology for? And we need to solve real world problems, and they are out there. So what I'd like to talk to you today is share the story of Red 6, and a problem that we're trying to solve at Red 6, which I think represents a multi-billion-dollar a year opportunity and a national security crisis in the making as well. So my own background, my name is Dan Robinson. I'm discovering in tech that even though we don't know everyone, you use the first name only. So my name is Dan. My background, as alluded to, I was a fighter pilot in the Royal Air Force for 10 years or so, graduate of Fighter Weapons School, which you may know as Top Gun. And in 2006, was lucky enough to be selected to fly this. I was the first non-American to fly F-22 Raptors for the US Air Force. This airplane is the most capable combat airplane in the world, an incredible stealth platform. And it gave me tremendous insight into an extraordinary capability of the platform, but not just the capabilities, but some of the real limitations and problems associated with not just this platform, but with the broader combat air force in itself. And what I'm talking about is training. You see, as fighter pilots, every time we go up to fly and train, we need someone to fly and train against. And that's a multi-billion-dollar a year problem that we were failing at back then. I left the Air Force in 2009, did a bunch of other stuff, ultimately came back to the United States in around 2015, really started asking myself the fundamental questions of life. What am I truly passionate about? What do I absolutely care about? And it came back to my love affair with aviation. My love affair with aviation, and my real interest in national security. And so I made a completely irrational decision to start building my own airplane. And it was nothing more than a passion project at the time in 2017. But it introduced 3 people into my life. 3 people walked into the hangar one day when I was building that airplane, all with backgrounds in VR and AR. And they became ultimately the 3 co-founders of Red 6, where now 2 of us remain, myself and a gentleman called Glenn Snyder, who couldn't be here today. But Glenn showed me some tech in 2015, which was pretty much a world first, and it looked like this.
Two racers, 2 separate tracks, but we're united on one virtual racetrack.
This is on another level. You've got the real physical forces combined with this mad world of a huge boulder flying through the sky, there's steam coming out of the ground. It's pretty amazing what the brain can cope with, and we're absolutely pushing that to the limit.
3, 2, 1, go!
So to be clear, what you were seeing there, two race cars, 2 separate racetracks in different locations, real race car drivers in them, in a virtual reality world, racing against each other real time. And the guys did that for Castrol Motor Oil, and it worked tremendously well. And when I saw it, I started reflecting on this national security crisis that I felt was emerging, the lack of training persistent in the US Air Force alone, and not just the US Air Force, but the broader flying services around the world. And so I started looking into it. You see, it's manifested by a number of entities. Firstly, we don't have the number of pilots we need to provide training. We're 2,000 pilots short on the front line. We don't have the airplanes and the assets to provide adversary aircraft. They're all broken from 20 years of combat in the Middle East. And we certainly don't have the dollars to provide the level of training that we needed to do. So how to solve that problem? The one final thing that was perhaps most concerning of all, as well, is as a nation, we've been involved in conflict in the Middle East for the last 20, 30 years or so. And whilst that's been going on, two fundamental things have been happening on the geopolitical landscape. One is the reemergence of Russia onto the world stage and proliferation of advanced technology around the world. And the second is the pace of innovation out of China. And that's extremely significant because we are now, as the United States and the West, faced with a peer adversary that has technology that is at least as good as what we have, and in some instances, better. And if we're not concerned about that, we are fundamentally wrong. And why do I say all of that? Because even if we had the pilots, the airplanes, and the dollars to solve the problem, we can't simulate the kind of near-peer threats that we may, God forbid, be called to go against. And that's a real national security crisis. So I called the Air Force up, having seen what Glenn had done in the technology, and I said, hey, look, I've got an idea emerging here. How are we doing with the training? What are you guys doing? And they said, well, look, we're trying to address the same problems you've identified, and we're coming up with an ecosystem called the Live Virtual Constructive Ecosystem. You may have heard of it as the synthetic training environment. Well, what is it? It aims to solve the same problems I've just identified, in that we don't have enough pilots or airplanes to put up in the air. So how do we solve it? Well, we put a combination of real pilots and real airplanes, live, with virtual real pilots and simulators on the ground, beamed up into the air as if they were there, virtual. And constructive is in essence the same thing as virtual, but it's AI-driven, acting pretty much autonomously. And that works to a certain extent, and synthetic training is the only way we are going to solve the training crisis of the future. It is coming, without a doubt. This is the way that we will train in the future, but there is one critical limitation. So to explain it, it is fundamentally a 50% solution. Why is that? Because the role of a fighter pilot is twofold, right? Out at range, let's keep the ranges completely unclassified. Let's say we're 100 miles away from each other. My role is to act as a three-dimensional chess player. Basically, I'm looking at 7 TV screens at once. I'm talking on 3 radios. I'm moving a bunch of airplanes around a 3-dimensional piece of sky. And I have to keep situational awareness on the airspace as I'm under massive duress and a huge cognitive load. Now, live virtual constructive works in that sense. That's called beyond visual range, where I'm looking at my radar sensors, I'm looking at my scopes to see entities on the track. And LVC works. It tricks the systems into thinking there are entities out there. Where it falls apart, however, is we start to enter within visual range. And within visual range, the role of a fighter pilot changes dramatically from this 3-dimensional chess player to you're putting the proverbial gum shield in and you're going for a fist fight. And it's an extremely violent environment to be in because you're physically and visually maneuvering against airplanes. And the problem with live virtual constructive is as soon as you enter that within visual range, 10 miles in, and we start to transition from looking at the radar scope to looking out, there's nothing there. Why is there nothing there? Because we can't synthetically render entities into the field of view of a pilot so far and have them behave as if they're real airplanes such that they can maneuver against them. And so the whole training ecosystem collapses. And until we solve that problem, an entirely synthetic training environment for the future is not something that we can realize. So, having seen what Glenn had produced, I asked 2 simple questions because I had an idea. And I said, Glenn, can we do what you've done in the race cars and airplanes? Yes, he said, more complicated and technically difficult. I said, okay, well look, that's great, but no one is going to allow fighter pilots to fly around in virtual reality, blind to the outside world. So can we do that in augmented reality? And he looked at me as if I was crazy and said, absolutely not. And I said, why? Not knowing anything about augmented reality at the time. And he explained to me the difficulties associated with augmented reality working outdoors at ground speeds, 5 miles an hour walking down the street, let alone 300-400 miles an hour up in a bright blue background, barrel rolling around each other at 9 Gs. So it was a definitive no, it can't be done. And me being the obnoxious fighter pilot, I kept asking why until he fundamentally got sick of me. And we kind of came up with a thesis that we thought at least might work. And I felt that if we could get this thesis to work and we could plug this into the broader LVC training environment, then now we had the opportunity to usher in a fundamentally new paradigm in training. And so I called the Air Force up and I said, hey, do you remember me? Well, I think I can save you billions of dollars a year. I think I can solve your pilot training shortage. And I think I can allow you to train against any near-peer threat. And here's my idea. And I pitched it. And the Air Force came back and said, guys, we've been looking for this for 5 years. No one has been able to do it. And I said, is it true? I said, absolutely. It was like a PowerPoint at the time. I said, but yeah, we can do it. And they gave us a series of milestones that would look ultimately to become a proof of concept that this would in fact work. Because what they said was over the last 3 years, we'd like you to build these scenarios. Can we take an airplane, a real pilot in a real airplane up into the sky? Can you put an augmented reality air-to-air refueling tanker up there? And can we go pull up alongside it and take gas? If you can do that, can we launch synthetic surface-to-air missiles from the ground? Can we evade and train against them? We've never been able to do that before. And the panacea was, can we engage with any threat and conduct air combat training in a visual environment? And have those entities, what you see on the right there is a modern Chinese J-20, can we have those entities controlled by AI, thinking and flying and fighting for themselves? So what am I talking about? Real pilot, real airplane, flying against an AR asset that doesn't exist, that is thinking and flying and fighting for itself in the sky. So that was our challenge. And over the last 3 years, we've been chipping away at doing that. And I'm pleased to say that as we stand here today, we've been successful in doing that. And I'm going to show you something here in a second. And the goal, the prize at the end of that was our first formal contract with the United States Air Force, which we've just been recently awarded, which is a $70 million IDIQ. So a tremendous success for the business. How did we do it? Well, that airplane that I was kind of sitting in backwards that looked like a canoe became this. So we finished building this over time, and that became, it's not just an airplane, but it became a mobile augmented reality flying laboratory, if you like. And the coders would sit, I think there's a couple of guys in the audience right now, but Glenn in particular would sit and spend hundreds of hours throwing up in the backseat of that airplane, coding live as we're up in the sky trying to pull this together. So that was the airplane. And inside the airplane, we built a system called ATARS. And ATARS may be something you've read about so far. It's the Advanced Tactical Air Augmented Reality System. So what does ATARS do? It allows us to go up in a real airplane, look through a visor system, and see augmented reality assets up in the sky, in the real world, controlled by artificial intelligence, that are thinking for themselves, that we can fly and fight against real time. And we can do that with multiple elements as well. How did we do it, or how does the system work at a really high level? Well, obviously technically extremely challenging to do, and we had two fundamental problems. As we all know in AR, the first one is how do we track? Because if we can't track, we can't do anything. And obviously the goal was, understanding 6DOF at any point in time in the most dynamic environments. I'm talking 300-400 miles an hour, upside down, barrel rolling, under G-force. How did we solve it? It wasn't possible initially. So what we did is we broke a seemingly impossible problem apart into two possible problems. And at a very high level, what we did was we tracked the vehicle, decoupled the tracking of the head from the tracking of the vehicle. So we tracked the vehicle independently and got a real-time absolute 6DOF position relative to the real world. And then we tracked the pilot's head relative to the airplane inside the cockpit. And we basically add those together, and that gives us a 6DOF ultimate solution relative to the real world in absolute terms. And once we'd figured that out, we thought, fantastic, we're going to be billionaires. Well, now what we're going to do is find the best headset in the market, plug it into an Air Force helmet, jam it in there, and we've got a solution. This is going to be it. We'll pitch it to the Air Force. And so we did that. We went out and we got every headset you can name, and we tried them all. And I took them all flying, and they didn't work. They weren't remotely good enough for what we needed to do. Because we're talking about bright blue background, white clouds, a 10,000 nit environment. We're talking about high speeds, massive crossing angles, so we need fields of view out here. 30 to 40 degrees field of view, indoor capable is not going to cut it for us. So that left us with a problem that we had to solve, and solve it we did. Before we move on though, in terms of the individual components of ATARS, I'd just like to highlight something, because we talk about, obviously we're all talking about the metaverse right now. Well, if you read Matthew Ball's article on the metaverse, or what is the metaverse, or what makes up the metaverse, he's talking about it's got to have hardware, it's got to have compute, it's got to have virtual entities in it. It has to have services and assets, and it has to have protocols. There are two others. There are payment services, and there are networking. I would argue that with ATARs, we've got 5 of those 7 sitting there. As for the other 2, just hold that thought. So off we got. David Benelli, where are you at? Are you in the audience somewhere? If you are, please raise your hand. David Benelli really led this charge on the development of our headsets. And it went from what we saw on the left there, where that thing was like glue gun to my head, and I'd be burned senseless. I looked like Harry Potter on several occasions with scars all over me. And we'd actually take that thing flying and iterate real time in the world, up in the sky. It was producing about 300 nits to the eye at any point in time. It was 105 degrees field of view, and it was sufficient to get us going in a proof of concept. But over the last 18 months now, we've been iterating until the product right now that we're flying with, EVE 2.7, the Enhanced Visual Environment, it's our own headset. And what we're generating with that now is 3,750 nits to the eye. It's about 105 degrees field of view, 120 hertz frame rate. And that's good enough now under the visor to go up in a bright blue sky, white cloud background, and visually see these things with sufficient resolution to be able to fly against them. I'm always conscious and extremely sensitive of making claims and showing rendered versions of what technology can do without actually demonstrating it real world. So I'm going to show you some footage now, which is in-headset footage that has come from actually EVE 2.5, the one in the middle. So nowhere near as good as 2.7, and certainly not as good as what we've got coming next year. But it's really important for me to show this, and you'll really see it's in-headset footage. So that was from our previous generation headset. That is real world, up in the skies of Southern California, filmed from the airplane we're flying with a headset in the back seat and an iPhone jammed up inside the headset trying to get that footage for you. This is really important for you guys to understand. This is not a concept. This is working, and the Air Force are buying into it. This is what's coming next year. This is our final product, which will ultimately ship out to the Air Force, and we'll conduct our first integration into a T-38. That's going to be the first recipient of this. The specifications on this headset, it's 120 degrees field of view. We're actually able to get 18,000 nits to the eye. Now, obviously, we have to control that, which we'll do through ambient light sensors. A frame rate of 120 hertz, overall motion to photon latency across the stack of 10 milliseconds, and an optical efficiency of 1.8%. I'm told by my optics guys that's really cool. But if you've got any technical questions, they're in here somewhere. You guys can answer it. But pretty compelling, looks awesome. We're really excited by this. I can tell you 2.7 that we're flying right now is really, really special. This is going to be absolutely eye-watering. The next step for us, and what we're in the middle of right now, is developing Carbon. Carbon is the Common Augmented Reality Battlespace Operational Network. What is that? All of the qualities of the metaverse that Matthew Ball outlines, right? I highlighted 5 that I would argue exist within the ATAR system. We've now created a network on top of that as well. And what that enables us to do is, if you look at the 2 blue entities, Berkut 1, Berkut 2, it allows multiplayers to enter the environment. So what have we actually fundamentally created here? The world's first multiplayer video game, outdoors, up in the sky. Oops. There we go. So we now have 2 test airplanes that are flying together, 2 individuals in each airplane, locked together in that world, adjusted for parallax, both sharing an experience up in the sky, flying with a wingman against virtual entities that are up in space. The network that we've created as well offers us the ability to operate across geographical disparate locations. So we're working between Camarillo and Santa Monica, around about 40 miles distance. We have people in virtual reality headsets on the ground in Santa Monica flying avatars of themselves against pilots and test airplanes up in Camarillo, 40 miles away. And that's working real time right now. So we're in the midst of developing that out as we stand. What have we done now? We've taken 6 of those things which define a metaverse according to Matthew Ball. So we're basically absent payment services. I think what we're creating here is the military metaverse, the first stab at it. And it's actually working. One of the qualities of the metaverse, of course, is persistence. Is it persistent? Right now, it's not. No. Could it be? Absolutely. So we're looking at this as not just a training entity, as a standalone entity, but maybe taking a slice of life and the ability to go and actually execute campaigns. Think World of Warcraft, across multiple days, where we step into this metaverse in a military context and we execute campaigns across the multiple days. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to skip this. This is what we've done in the last couple of years. Focus on the bottom. We've got some really cool partners, cool investors. We're the recipient of Epic Games' first grant into DoD. Lockheed Martin invested in us. And Snowpoint Ventures were a spin-off of Palantir, so they've been massively helpful in terms of the support, but obviously a lot accomplished in a couple of years, which we're really proud of. I'm going to finish with one video, aware of time, but I think it's worth you guys seeing this.
Red 6 is an augmented reality platform company. We build solutions that enable things that are impossible using augmented reality.
We're currently focused on our shortest term goals, which are getting our solutions into fighter pilot cockpits, basically enabling the fighter pilots to be able to see entities that don't exist and fight and train against them.
Every time a fighter pilot goes up to fly and train, they need someone to fly and train against, and that's a multi-billion-dollar-a-year problem. We don't have the airplanes, we don't have the money, we don't have the pilots, and even if we did, we're not capable of simulating modern near-peer threats.
And then you add in any of the actual risk factors or the human lives into it, it becomes a math problem that doesn't look so great for you.
What we've done with the augmented reality is seek to replace the need to put the adversary aircraft and all of the associated costs up in the sky. We can do that through augmented reality and using Unreal to simulate any threat we want in the world, and that's a tremendously exciting value proposition.
We've talked to a number of different pilots about this, both Air Force and Navy and many others. They're curious but skeptical because they think, how's this going to work? Because they've used head-up displays for multiple decades now, but are extremely narrow, one color, sometimes only one eye.
We're asking the technology to do a lot of things. First, we need to track and understand what the airplanes do, what the pilot's head is, what the pilot is looking at in the most dynamic environments. 300 to 400 miles an hour, pulling 9Gs, doing aerobatics. We need to then draw really quickly to a display technology that's capable of working outdoors in bright environments across a network. And we're saying, oh, by the way, we need to do that sub 20 milliseconds for it to be training value. So there's a massive amount of technical hurdles that we've had to overcome, but I'm delighted to say that we've done it, and it is working spectacularly well. And the Unreal Engine has been a huge part of that.
Doing augmented reality correctly requires extremely low latency.
When you're on the ground and you're doing something in augmented reality, there's kind of an almost like fudged error that doesn't exist in the air. So now we're doing 300 miles an hour plus, and any of those discrepancies or deviations show themselves in quarter-mile distances.
So anything that you can do to shrink this latency stack has a massive impact on the realism and therefore the training value. Did we start with Unreal Engine? No, we didn't. But we moved to it as soon as we could.
We saw about a third of the original latency that we had from our previous solution. After that, it was no questions asked. This is how we're going to build this tool.
The biggest challenge we're trying to display synthetic assets is tracking. Without tracking, it doesn't matter how good your augmented reality display is because it's going to be dancing all over the place.
They can go up, down, left, right, do barrel rolls, do backflips, whatever. So how do you figure out where that head is now? Not necessarily where the aircraft is, but where is that pilot or where is that co-pilot looking?
So we had to invent a totally new method of tracking, that we track the head in relative terms and we track the aircraft in absolute terms. You put those two together, you bind a camera to it in UE4, and you have a 300 miles per hour augmented reality solution that you can use, and that's exactly what we built.
The reactions we've been getting from pilots, they've just been incredible.
The first time you're up in a real airplane and you look out of the window and there's a big old airplane flying around in the sky that doesn't actually exist. And the penny drops in that they start to understand the real training value.
They get out and they go, where the heck has this been? We want it now. Why can't this be in my cockpit tomorrow?
Red 6 today is a video game in the sky, focused on the Department of Defense. But looking beyond that, that's where the real excitement comes from, because we're building the future in all fields, military and civilian.
Guys, that's the story of Red 6. Thank you very much for your time.
I think we might have time for one question. Anybody want to jump in? Sir? Go ahead.
That last thing that you talked about, carbon, with the campaigns and all that, sounded kind of like what the Army might be doing with its $22 billion contract. Do you know anything about that?
I know a lot about that, and yes, it's fundamentally different, right? Because what the Army are doing, are trying to solve for is a different problem to what we're trying to solve for. They are trying to solve for the dismounted soldier running around on the ground. And that's an entirely different problem to the one we're solving as well. It's interesting because we're actually in discussions right now with that program and thinking about how can we potentially link the Carbon network into systems such as what the Army are working on the ground. Because as Carbon points out, you know, we don't go to war just as an Air Force, right? We go across domains, soldiers, sailors, and airmen. So we need to be able to train across domains, and it's imperative that we can talk and interact with individuals on the ground so we can train that way. So very familiar with what's going on, acutely aware of the problems associated with it, but very different to what we're doing. This is working, and it's working today.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.